Field Eyes.
Previously on Peeled Eyes. Survivor's second season, set down under in the Australian Outback, premiered in the spring of 2001. The show moved from Wednesdays to Thursdays as it went head-to-head with the ratings champion, Friends. The new tribes battled back and forth in the pre-merge, and ultimately, a freak accident led to equal numbers at the merge. As the season progressed, Colby became a universally loved hero, Jerry emerged as a contender for the most hated person in America, and Tina pulled the strategic strings from off-screen. It was Tina who went on to become the second sole survivor in a shock victory over the Golden Boy from Texas. 5 old school seasons are left, and Survivor Africa will go next.
Do not adjust your picture. This is not a test broadcast. If you're seeing this, you have been selected to participate in a very important project. It has come to our attention that YouTube channel Peeled Eyes is approaching 1,000 subscribers. We'd very much like for this to happen, and would very much like for you, yes you, to be a part of it. Simply click the subscribe button and you'll forever have our thanks. Remember, our eyes are always peeled, and because of that, yours probably should be too. Subscribe to Peeled Eyes, and tell your friends to do the same. Now, back to our regular program.
Chapter 3 of our old school story picks up in the summer of 2001, where Survivor at the Australian Outback has just finished airing. At this point in time, Survivor was an outlier in the world of television. Its warp speed success and competitive reality format were like nothing anyone had ever seen before. Lightning had indeed struck twice, as somehow, some way, the Australian Outback was arguably even more popular than Borneo had been. It's true that Survivor would never again reach the heights of Borneo's finale in terms of ratings. However, the buzz and cultural awareness around the show had exploded due to the massive popularity of the Outback castaways. In part 2 of this series, I discussed the flood of new reality shows that popped up in Survivor's wake, which all added fuel to the reality hype train. This new form of TV went from an experiment to an inescapable trend within the space of a single TV season. However, the media's obsession with the Outback castaways during the summer of 2001 would ultimately be the peak of reality show mania. Because as we all know, in the fall of that year, the world would change forever. It's basically a cliche to bring up the September 11th attacks in any video essay that is even remotely related to the early 2000s. You don't need me or a video about Survivor to explain that everything was different after 9/11. We all know that. However, the specific effect that the attacks had on the television industry is crucial to Survivor's history. In the hours and days after the towers were hit, all 4 of the major American TV networks aired non-stop news coverage instead of their regular programming, and many cable channels like MTV and ESPN followed suit. For the first and only time since the assassination of JFK, no commercials were aired on TV, as it was universally understood that this was not a time for frivolous ads or entertainment, which of course brings us back to Survivor. Survivor Africa was set to make its debut on October 11th, 2001, just 1 month after the attacks. The country and the world as a whole were still just beginning to process the biggest cultural shift of our lifetime. Most TV shows, especially reality TV with its sleazy and exploitative reputation, were seen as just nonsense. Add to that the fact that a decent portion of Survivor's appeal in the early days was literally watching ordinary people suffer and starve, and you can start to see why the near-ubiquitous American obsession with the show had dissipated before Africa premiered. Survivor would remain relatively popular amongst network TV shows, but the utter mania that surrounded Borneo and Australia would never be seen again. As we first discovered during the Bryant Gumbel-hosted Australia reunion, Survivor Africa was filmed in Kenya. More specifically, the 3rd iteration of the original social strategy game would unfold in the Shaba National Reserve, a semi-desert grassland located in the northern portion of Kenya. Shaba is the poster child for what most people imagine when they think
African safari.
This part of the world is one that is equal parts beautiful and stark, a somewhat paradoxical place that on the surface might appear drab and dead, but in reality is a hotbed for all kinds of life, both human and animal. This portion of Kenya is the traditional home of the Samburu people, a nomadic tribe who have thrived in this area for hundreds of years due mainly to their cattle herding skills. These people live alongside some of Earth's most incredible animals, including elephants, zebras, giraffes, ostriches, and ibex, not to mention predators such as hyenas, jackals, leopards, and of course, lions. There have actually been 3 major productions shot on the Shaba Reserve. First in 1966 was the film Born Free, which was based on Joy Adamson's experiences living with lions. Then in 1985 came Out of Africa, the Robert Redford and Meryl Streep romance that took home 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Which brings us to Survivor, the third and so far final major production to be lucky enough to shoot in Shaba. Survivor Africa was filmed from July 11th to August 18th of 2001, which is actually the coolest time of year in Kenya, although temperatures still average in the mid-80s on the Fahrenheit scale during these months. By choosing this location, Survivor's producers had upped the ante yet again. The banks of the Herbert River had been tougher than Palau Tiga's beaches and jungle, and now the Shaba Reserve promised an even harsher experience than Australia, which is certainly saying something. While Survivor has always been a social politics game first and foremost, you could easily make the case that Season 3 offered the biggest challenge in terms of actual survival that the series ever saw. Like was always the case with old school seasons of Survivor, Africa saw the introduction of 16 new castaways. These people were cast with the same philosophy under which the first 2 casts were assembled. 16 fairly ordinary Americans from different walks of life. Old school casting was definitely a double-edged sword. We always got a cast of down-to-earth everyday people as opposed to models and actors from LA, or the more recent trend of clout chasers who just want to grow their Instagram and Twitter followings. And I think this approach to casting was highly beneficial to the social experiment side of Survivor that is all but gone in the new era. However, it's blatantly obvious that many older casts lack diversity, falling in line with the early reality TV standby of including a single gay man and 1 or 2 people of color to avoid a fully white cast. While Survivor has always been a show that broke social barriers, I think it's only fair to call it out for adhering to others, even if it was the status quo for the time. More in-depth casting information is difficult to come by in the case of Survivor Africa. However, based on the franchise's massive popularity at the time, I think it's safe to assume that a similar number of people applied to be on this season compared to the roughly 70,000 applicants that threw their hat in the ring for the Australian Outback. Those thousands of hopefuls were pared down to these 16 people, which we were formally introduced to through the same classic montage that we saw in seasons 1 and 2. If I've said it once, I've said it a million times. This is the ideal way to introduce a Survivor cast. It's quick, it's informative, it gives every cast member their moment in the sun, and it never should have been removed from the show. This time around, our initial tribes were the Boran tribe in yellow and the Samburu tribe in red, both named for actual African tribes that live on or near the Shaba Reserve. Africa's marooning stuck close to the Survivor season opening blueprint that fans were already accustomed to by this point. The pre-divided tribes were marooned into the game via an abrupt evacuation and scramble for supplies, followed by a trek to camp sequence where the initial social dynamics start to emerge. Unlike the first 2 seasons, the edited story of Survivor Africa doesn't have an obvious central figure or narrator. Borneo had Richard Hatch, and Australia had Colby, but Africa's edit was a bit more scattershot and less traditional. Kinda like Lex Vandenberg.
Lex Vandenberg, a 38-year-old father and marketing manager from Santa Cruz, California.
Lex is a bit of a unicorn in Survivor history. He is one of the bigger names from the old school era who even newer and casual fans of the series can often recognize. Yet at the same time, he is both highly unlikable as a character and perhaps uniquely bad at the game. He's amongst the most complex figures ever constructed by reality TV, and he's a player that I've always had a personal fondness for despite his many missteps on Survivor. If Richard showed us the base blueprint for winning Survivor, Lex showed us an equally effective method for losing the game. We'll follow his blunders as the season moves along, but for now, I need to highlight Lex's first confessional, which set the tenor for his game and the season at large.
Without fire, you can't boil the water. Anybody knows that you don't just belly up to the stream that you're camping next to, drop your canteen in it and drink the water. You don't boil your water out here, you end up with what they call amoebic dysentery, which basically has you puking and crapping your guts out.
Our first introduction to Lex came in the form of a warning, a description of the consequences that come from drinking unboiled water. The struggle to remain hydrated is essential to how Survivor Africa's game unfolded, which might seem ridiculous to new viewers, but I think the fight against dehydration actually helps Africa stand out from other seasons. In old school Survivor, the new location of each season was effectively a game twist in that each new setting provided its own unique set of challenges, such as filthy, parasite-infested water. These natural hurdles influenced how the players thought and made decisions. In the early days, the changing setting could be as big of a shakeup as the twists we see in modern Survivor. The difference is that the various old school settings twisted the social experiment, while newer twists add wrinkles to the strategic parameters of the game. As we are going to see with Africa, both of these things affect who ultimately wins a game of Survivor. A quintessential example of how diverse locations used to affect the way a game of Survivor went down were the structures the tribes were forced to live in due to the potential for encounters with lions or other dangerous animals. These are bomas, circular enclosures made of thorny acacia branches that tribes in East Africa use to protect livestock and themselves from large predators. Upon first arrival at camp, each tribe was required to fortify a rundown boma that would act as their shelter for the entirety of the game. The bomas were actually a necessary safety precaution, as it's legitimately dangerous to live and sleep in this part of Kenya. There were even armed guards just off camera that served as extra protection for the cast and crew. And before you say it, no, that doesn't make Survivor quote-unquote fake, it's just the reality of filming a major production on the Shaba Reserve. Unlike other seasons, players were more inclined to stick close to camp and the safety of the boma. This led to fewer private conversations, especially early on in the game, and the strategic talks that did occur had to be conducted very subtly, as there were always plenty of extra ears floating around camp. Bomas might not have always made for the most riveting TV, but they did leave their mark on the season's gameplay. They added a truly unique mechanic that I think serves as a good example of how varied old school gameplay could be, even if it wasn't always the most exciting viewing material. Africa's pre-merge gave us a few historically important developments for the show, most of which took place on the Samburu side of things. But before we get to those, I want to cover the earliest stages of the game from Baran's perspective. Lex and the rest of the Baran tribe lost the first immunity challenge, which took the form of Quest for Fire, as was always the case in the old school format. At the season's first tribal council, Boran sent Diane, the Midwestern male woman, packing after a 6-2 vote. Unfortunately, Diane was a pretty obvious choice for first boot. Earlier in the premiere episode, she and Clarence had socially isolated themselves by eating without the rest of the tribe. Because Clarence was stronger and more of an asset in the challenges, Diane became the clear target. The first round in a game of Survivor is brutal. Any small mistake or flaw or quirk that a player has or makes can stick out in the minds of other players and can be reason enough to send them home. Rudy Bosch of Survivor Borneo fame once stated on a DVD commentary that the first round of Survivor is all about finding any little reason why someone, who isn't yourself, could be sent home, and then allowing that idea to spread throughout the tribe. We saw this time and time again with old school Survivor. Early game targets would emerge naturally as the group mentality of a tribe latched on to first impressions and social missteps. I mean, if we're being objective, Diane's mistake was massive compared to the reasoning used for some other early old school boots. Baran's fortunes did not improve in episode 2 as they lost both the reward and immunity challenges in this round, making them the first tribe to start 0-3 on challenges. But don't worry, Baran, you're not gonna hold that title for long. The immunity challenge in round 2 is one we gotta talk about. It was called Safari Supper, and it was simple to understand. Each player has to down a shot of cow's blood that was harvested right there in front of them on site. Safari Supper is a classic example of what are known simply as
gross food challenges.
Gross may actually be a misnomer because for many people, like the Samburu people in this case, this is not gross at all. It's just a fact of life. These challenges were always a tentpole event for early Survivor seasons. That all stemmed from the original version of the challenge that we saw in Borneo, titled Buggin' Out, which saw the survivors eating butak, or beetle larvae. The challenge got a big reaction for the new but already fervent Survivor fanbase, and the same was true when a new iteration appeared in the Australian Outback. These challenges lean more towards the outrageous, edgy shock side of early reality TV, and are most likely the main inspiration for Fear Factor's infamous second round. Like many old school staples, the gross food challenge is a thing of the past, and I highly doubt that it will ever make a comeback. Still, I find these challenges to be a charming, if outdated, piece of the old school special sauce. They are yet another example of early Survivor's focus on location and culture, which is something we're going to talk a lot more about in the latter half of the season. At their second straight tribal council, Boran voted out Jesse Camacho. Weird fact about Jesse. These days, it's safe to say that most fans of the show don't even know who she is, but during her 2-episode run, she was technically the most popular Survivor player up to that point. In the old school era, Survivor's website was, relatively speaking, one of the most popular places on the internet. Among the website's main features was its player popularity polls, where fans could give their approval ratings on each player from the current season. Jesse Camacho, second boot of Survivor Africa, holds the record for highest ever fan approval rating, as she reached a staggering 96% approval going into episode 2. Even Colby, Survivor's version of Superman, could only dream of player poll numbers like that. So why did everyone love Jesse so much? Well, we'll never know for sure, but there are 2 factors that most people tend to point to. First, Jesse was a sheriff's deputy, and in post 9/11 America, there was a rapid surge of support for law enforcement and firefighters. And second, well, there's no other way to put it. She was hot. And there you go, just like that, 96% of the country loves you. It's around this point in the season that we started to see the development of Africa's major alliance, which just goes to show how much the pace of the game has increased. Today we see alliances form as soon as the tribes arrive at camp. In Africa, it was more of a slow burn, as we had to wait a few episodes before we were shown the formation of the Boran Boys. Much of Survivor Africa's legacy amongst the fan base comes down to 3 players, which just so happen to be the members of the Boran Boys. First up was, of course, Lex, who up to this point of the season has acted as the non-controversial leader of the Boran tribe. The second member was Lex's best friend throughout the game, Big Tom Buchanan. Big Tom was never much of a player on Survivor. Instead, the goat farmer from Virginia was a straight shooter, if you could actually understand what he was saying, that is, that acted as comic relief for the show. He was a great example of Survivor's ability to create memorable TV characters out of real people. If I'm being honest, Tom stood very little chance of ever winning the game, but that's okay. Most people who get cast for the show have no chance. They are just there because they make good TV. And rounding out the Boran Boys roster was the player who is perhaps most synonymous with this season, Ethan Zohn.
Ethan Zohn, a 27-year-old professional soccer player from Lexington, Massachusetts.
Ethan wasn't the biggest presence on the show in the early episodes, but he was lingering around and usually got a confession or 2 each episode. His role in the season's narrative grew as the game went on, but in this first section of the game, he was kind of the third amigo to Tom and Lex. But that allowed him to grow closer to Kim Johnson, a relationship that would certainly come in handy later. With only 6 people left on Boran, this tight alliance of 3, plus Kim as an associate, gave the Boran Boys the power to dictate votes on this side of the game. And of course, that was the current meta for Survivor gameplay at the time. Establish a majority alliance like Richard did, gain a numerical advantage at the merge, pagong the weaker tribe, and battle it out amongst the alliance. Of course, there is more nuance to it than that, which has me thinking that I might make a companion series of videos for the old school history that breaks down what was considered meta gameplay in different time periods of Survivor. I know I can barely get one of these history videos out a year, but here I am talking about doing another series. Anyway, let me know if that's something you'd be interested in seeing in the comments. Back to Africa, it should come as no surprise that the same gameplay that we saw at Boran was also occurring at Samburu, but in this case, 2 separate alliances had formed. We often see groups on Survivor come together based on age, and the Samburu tribe dynamics are the perfect example of that. Carl, Linda, Frank, and Teresa, the elders of the tribe, had come together as a fledgling alliance that planned to target the younger players. Specifically, they were looking to take out Kim Powers, Brandon, and Lindsay, the original 3 members of an alliance I like to call the Mallrats. While the Boran tribe is more synonymous with Africa's legacy, it was actually the Samburu tribe that made all the headlines while the season was airing, and that's mainly because of the Mallrats. The Mallrats were portrayed as being lazy, entitled, and snarky, which may or may not have been the case in reality, but regardless of that, the edit cast them in a much less than favorable light. While Jerry Manthe will always be the poster child for hated Survivor castaways, the Mallrats as an entity gave her a run for her money. This goes double for Lindsay Richter. People couldn't stand this woman, and the vast majority of fans couldn't wait to see her get voted off. What did Lindsay do to inspire so much ill will from the audience? Well, pretty much the same thing Jerry did back in the Australian Outback, which is to say she spoke her mind in confessionals and, well, that's about it. It didn't take a whole lot to earn the ire of Survivor fans back in the day, and Lindsay is the latest example of the dog pile that tended to occur when a Survivor was perceived as quote-unquote bitchy. One of the more popular questions levied at old school Survivor is, why didn't the players ever flip on their alliance and take control of the game when the opportunity provided itself? Well, there are multiple answers to this, including that the tactic simply hadn't been proven to be effective yet, but I would argue that Lindsay's unearned hatred from the fans was another contributor. It can be hard for new fans to wrap their head around the idea that the morality of players within the game could affect their real lives outside of it. People didn't flip because they didn't want to be forever labeled as a traitor that all of America hates. Nowadays, both fans and players alike can separate the way a castaway comes across on the show and how they play the game from who they are as a real person. But in the early 2000s, that simply was not the case, and people like Lindsay and Jerry paid the price for that. Samburu faced their first tribal council in episode 3, and if you were to go by the edit, it all seemed cut and dry as to who was going home. Lindsay, who was looked at as the ringleader of the Mallrats, would be eliminated by the votes of the Samburu elders, plus the vote of the one Samburu player I have yet to mention. Unfortunately, for the second season in a row, one of the most important players for the show's early history happens to be a pretty despicable person in real life. I'm talking about Silas Gaither, who is currently serving his slap-on-the-wrist sentence of 6 years probation for sexual crimes against multiple women. He's another garbage stain on Survivor's history, and an elephant in the room that we're just gonna have to put up with. Logically, you would probably assume that Silas would fall in with the Mallrats. At the time he played, he was only a few years removed from being a walking stereotype as a finance frat bro at the University of Tennessee. Yet, because of his physical strength, he was courted by both sides, and all editing signs leading up to the episode 3 tribal pointed towards him working with the elders to form a majority 5-person alliance. However, when tribal council rolled around, that's not how things shook out. What we have here is a case of a player in the optimal power position making the clearly suboptimal move, as he chose to roll the dice and become the 4th official member of the Mallrats. The resulting vote was an even split, 4 votes against Carl and 4 votes against Lindsay. As I discussed in part 2, the tiebreaker procedure was a little different for the first handful of Survivor seasons. First came a revote in which the 2 players that received votes cannot vote and the remaining players can only vote for one of those 2. This vote also came back tied at 3-3, which means the tribe was deadlocked. The rules for seasons 2 and 3 stated that upon a deadlocked vote, the player with the most votes from previous tribal councils is eliminated, a la Jeff Varner at the Australia merge. But of course, this was Samburu's first tribal, and therefore, no player had previous votes. Thus, for the first and I believe only time, a tie vote was broken with a trivia question. This procedure would be changed starting with season 4, and trust me, we'll be talking plenty about that. But in Africa, we saw Carl, who, mind you, was a doctor of dental medicine, get eliminated via a biology trivia question. Yeah, it's no secret why they changed the tiebreaker. I'm clearly an old school apologist, but even I can admit that this was pretty lame. Carl's elimination vindicated Silas's choice to join up with the Mallrats and effectively gave him complete control of the Samburu tribe. The Mallrats held a 4-3 advantage in the numbers, and despite his initial hesitancy to join, Silas was firmly in the leadership role of this alliance. But don't worry, because the reason that Silas is so relevant to Survivor history is that he was one of the first players to prove that you can fall just as fast as you rose. In episode 4, Samburu lost their 2nd consecutive immunity challenge, which sealed Linda's fate as she was the weakest among the remaining Samburu elders. While this elimination might not be very significant, what led up to it certainly was. Before heading to tribal council, the Mallrats, spearheaded by Silas, decided to ask the Samburu elders to place their votes on Lindsay. This does make strategic sense, as Lindsay was the only member of Samburu to receive votes thus far. By maintaining this, the Mallrats would limit their vulnerability at a potentially deadlocked vote during the merge round. However, this does not make sense socially, especially given that the Mallrats literally told Frank, Teresa, and Linda that there was nothing in it for them. They would simply be doing the Mallrats a favor.
Whoever's being voted off tonight should vote for Lindsay.
And what's in it for us?
Nothing.
As you might imagine, this plan backfired on the power-tripping Mallrats. Rather than helping the rats out by piling their votes on Lindsay, the remaining Samburu elders cast their votes for Silas, weakening both his own personal position and that of the Mallrats as they approached the merge. For his part, Silas really didn't care though. In fact, he thought he pretty much had the game wrapped up.
I do.
There's not an event in the future that would alarm me. I can't wait till the merge because I plan on winning this. You might as well write the check and hand it to me because I'm shooting for the stars and I'm gonna get there.
And maybe he would have, if it weren't for the first true twist in Survivor history. Twists have become a staple in reality TV. These days, reality competitions are like the Twilight Zone. You go into it expecting to be hit with a twist. But back in 2001, all everyone knew about and expected from Survivor was what they had previously seen. 16 players started the game on 2 tribes, the tribes merged when 10 people were left, and the game played out from there. Africa changed that forever, and taught players and viewers alike that the game was a fluid thing that could change as it went on. All of that started in episode 5, aptly titled
The Twist.
A tree mail message informed both tribes that they must each select 3 tribe members to embark on a quest. No other details were given, which left the tribes in the dark as to what was actually going to happen to the selected castaways. Thus, Baran chose to send Lex, Big Tom,
and Kelly,
while Samburu, aka Silas, elected himself along with Teresa and Frank for the mysterious mission. Both groups were made to hike back to the place where they were initially marooned in Shaba, where they found Jeff Probst waiting for them. This dusty plain with the Kenyan mountains rising high in the background is one of the most instantly recognizable settings for any Survivor scene. Every fan that is familiar with this season can pick out this location in their memory in a similar manner to the famous bird shot from Australia. And that's because of the absolute bombshell that Jeff dropped once both groups had arrived. The 3 members of each tribe were told to drop their buffs, a phrase that would become a piece of the Survivor lexicon going forward. Lex, Tom, and Kelly would not be returning to Baran. Instead, Silas, Frank, and Teresa would be joining the Yellow Tribe, while the former Baran members would be inducted into Samburu, the first ever tribe swap seen on Survivor. In modern Survivor, tribe swaps have become part of the fabric of the game and usually occur multiple times per season. The implications of a tribe swap are pretty obvious. Alliances and social bonds are broken up and players are forced to adapt to new surroundings. The tribe swap is perhaps the most basic of all Survivor twists, but at the same time, it can be the most impactful, and this original version is evidence of that. The Africa twist floored both the players and the audience. Again, keep in mind that at the time, the rules of Survivor were seen as a fixed thing that were never going to change. The swap blew that notion to smithereens and opened up the possibility that truly anything could happen during the course of a game of Survivor. The tribe swap in Africa led to the creation of what are known as New Baran and New Samburu, and set up 2 of the more significant eliminations in Survivor history. With the 2 remaining Samburu outsiders joining up with Ethan, Kelly, and Clarence at New Baran, Silas had gone from untouchable majority leader to highly vulnerable pariah over the course of just 1 day. The opportunity to take out such a big competitor was too good to pass up, which led Ethan to implement a new strategic technique for the first time in the show's history: the Throne Challenge. Intentionally losing an immunity challenge in order to take out a big threat is a maneuver that has seen plenty of use on Survivor with varying degrees of success. It's a risky move, but one that can pay off in a huge way if done successfully and subtly. In the old school era, it was a rare occurrence as players tended to approach the game with integrity in mind as to not be seen as an underhanded competitor by the fan base. Therefore, I find it pretty ironic that Ethan, one of Survivor's most universally liked players, was the first to make use of the Throne Challenge. New Baran, or at least the members who were in on the plan, fumbled their way through Puzzle of Shields, the episode 5 immunity challenge, and ultimately managed to lose intentionally without being too blatant about it. The fix was in, and Silas's fate was sealed. A player who just 3 days ago was firmly in control of the game was sent home in a 5-1 vote, which gave Silas the honor of being the first of what fans call a swap screw. A player is considered to have been swap screwed if they were not in danger prior to a swap occurring and then are subsequently sent home after being swapped onto a tribe in which they are in the strategic minority. Thus, the fall of Silas Gaither was complete. He rose to power on day 9 and was gone on day 15, proving that power in Survivor can indeed shift in a huge way in the blink of an eye. Thanks for the contribution to Survivor history, Silas, but also good riddance to a disgusting criminal. In episode 6, titled,
I'd never do it to you,
we saw another important tribal council take place. New Samburu lost the immunity challenge, which all but guaranteed another deadlocked vote, considering the 6 votes were evenly split based on old tribal lines. It's here where I'd like to take a moment to shine the spotlight on Kim Johnson. Spoiler alert here, but Kim went pretty far in this game. However, she doesn't get much respect as a player and is often considered a passenger that rode along with the Baran boys. But in this round, she actually made a rather large contribution to the gameplay of this season, as it was Kim who managed to set the target for this vote even though she wasn't participating in the tribal council. Before a challenge, Kim used hand signals to make an L shape to tip off Kelly that Lindsay was the old Samburu member with the most previous votes against, a piece of intel that Kim had picked up from Frank and Teresa back at the Baran camp. This often forgotten move gave Kelly, Lex, and Big Tom the upper hand needed to win out at the deadlock, and ensured that Old Baran had the numerical advantage at the merge. In the end, Lindsay was sent home as the Mallrats placed their votes on Big Tom, who had 0 votes from previous tribals. This made Lindsay the only player in Survivor history to be involved in more than one deadlocked vote. I know, it's a weird piece of trivia, but it's true. In the following episode, the tribes merged, and as I just mentioned, Old Baran held the numbers, with 6 members to Old Samburu's 4. If you haven't seen this season, you would probably assume, based on Old School Survivor's reputation, that the next 4 rounds played out as a pagonging, but that actually wasn't the case. In fact, true pagongings were pretty rare in the Old School game, despite what you may have heard. There wasn't one in Australia, and there wasn't one in Africa either, as it was a Baran who was taken out at the merge round. As is usually the case in a game of Survivor, the first individual immunity challenge was a test of endurance. This time, it was a challenge that has gone on to become a true Survivor classic, called When It Rains, It Pours. Like any good endurance challenge, this one is simple in premise and difficult in execution. Players stand with one arm raised and tethered to a bucket of water. If the player moves their arm too much, the bucket will tip and douse the player with water, eliminating them from the challenge. Last one standing wins. The challenge came down to an hours-long showdown between Clarence and Teresa, who both felt that they were on the chopping block. After 6 hours, Clarence knew he wasn't going to outlast Teresa, and so he offered her a game of rock, paper, scissors to decide an early winner. This was one of, if not the first example of a deal being cut during a challenge, a move that we would see often in future seasons. But here in Africa, Clarence's gamble didn't pay off as he chose rock to T-Bird's paper, which left him vulnerable heading into the vote. The reason Clarence was such an obvious, glaring target during this round, despite technically being part of the majority numbers-wise, was actually because of what happened last season. Again, the Africa players only had 2 prior seasons of context to model their game off of, so a lot of their decision-making was heavily influenced on what they had just seen go down on the Australian Outback. And what they saw was a young, athletic guy running the table when it came to individual immunity challenges. From the start of Season 3 and beyond, Survivor players have been hyper-aware of the danger posed by the post-merge physical threat, and because of this, physically strong players tend to become targets at the merge. The history of merge round tribal councils is littered with the snuff torches of muscle-bound dudes and former high school sports stars, all casualties from the war against another Colby. With no necklace to save him, Clarence was voted out at the newly formed Moto Maji's first trip to Tribal Council. But crucially, this vote was not quite unanimous. It actually came back as an 8-2 vote, with not 1, but 2 votes for Lex. Of course, Clarence had voted for Lex, and that was okay, but that second mystery vote drove Lex nuts and set the course for the rest of this game and the franchise's history. From the very start of the next episode, Lex was on the warpath. Up until this point in the season, Lex had been the even-keeled, dependable voice of Baran, but this one rogue vote was about to turn him into a paranoid train wreck that burned down his own game and the games of a few other players. Chief among them, Kelly Goldsmith.
Kelly Goldsmith, a 22-year-old behavioral research analyst from Rancho Santa Fe, California.
In my opinion, Kelly was an A+ in terms of Survivor casting. She had both a big personality and a cunning mind for the game, but crucially, this woman could cut a confessional with the best of them.
Today, Lex came up with this scheme. Lex, the Grandmaster Lex, that for some reason people bow to. I don't understand why.
The ability to play to the cameras and deliver memorable quotes during a confessional is another Survivor skill that players developed as the old school seasons went on. I would say of the first 48 people to play the game, Kelly Goldsmith was the best at playing up to the crowd, and that's a testament to her personality, as I don't think she was necessarily doing it on purpose. I think she really was just being herself out there. Either way, she left her mark on the show, and she even joined Survivor's casting department, being a big part of the team that put together Survivor Vanuatu's excellent cast. I personally think Kelly is one of the old school characters that has only gotten better with rewatches. It was Kelly who unfortunately became Lex's chief suspect in his paranoid whodunit search for the rogue voter. The only problem was, she really didn't cast that vote, despite her sneaky reputation. Here, let me let Kelly explain it in her own words.
Okay, well, it really wasn't me, but screw you, Lex, if you're gonna sit here and yell at me like you're my dad, and I'm 5, and I just stole cookies for something I didn't do.
Lex's reaction during this round was the textbook example of how not to handle receiving an unexpected vote at Tribal Council. He directly confronted multiple members of the tribe, moped around the boma, and just generally lacked self-awareness. Lex has never been loved by the show's fan base, and that stems back to this episode. Despite being seen as a bitter hypocrite by fans, Lex is often remembered as one of the strategic faces of Survivor's old school era. However, a rewatch of his time playing the game proves over and over again just how poor of a Survivor player Lex really was. He was involved in some of the biggest and most memorable moments from this era, but I think the details of how he handles those moments often gets forgotten. For example, just look at how Lex would approach the hours leading up to a tribal council when he knew who was going to be voted out. Starting with Clarence, Lex felt this incessant need to tell the target that they were going home ahead of time in a quote-unquote man-to-man conversation. On the surface, he claimed this was the ethical and respectful thing to do, but in reality, Lex was just starting to manage the jury. Players setting up the jury in a way that favors them at Tribal Council was nothing new. I mean, they had been doing that since literally day one. But nobody had been as obvious about it as Lex was with his pre-tribal target confessions. Round 8 of Survivor Africa was one of the worst played rounds the show has ever seen. With Lex convinced that Kelly was the snake who had dared to vote for him, Kelly attempted a flip to save herself. Had Lex just kept his cool, she would have stuck by him, but his paranoia had pushed Kelly to switch loyalties. Kelly planned to add her vote in with the 4 remaining ex-Samburu players in order to oust Lex and pull off the first ever post-merge power flip. Had Survivor been a purely strategic game, this plan probably would have come off without a hitch. But Survivor is a social game above all, and it was social dynamics that derailed the first attempt at a power flip. Brandon and Frank had been at odds since the very start of the game, based on the fact that Brandon was gay and Frank being, well, ignorant. These two just did not get along, nor did they want to get along. And because of this mutual contempt, Brandon was dead set on not aligning with Frank, even if that meant giving up a chance to control the game. That's right. Brandon also flipped his vote and threw his lot in with the Baran boys and Kim Johnson. This meant that Lex was able to satiate his bloodlust and finally smoke out Kelly the snake. Wait, I thought Kelly was supposed to be the rat. Anyway, Lex just barely managed to scrape through round 8, and now he and the other Baran boys were positioned to run the rest of the game. This voting outcome, the one created by a whole bunch of bad gameplay choices, is perhaps the most important one in Survivor history. Without it, the whole franchise develops in a completely different way. I can't even begin to tell you all the things that never would have happened if Lex went home at this vote, but I can show you. Looks like I went back a little too far. This was the episode 9 reward challenge. And you know what, that actually kind of works out. I want to talk about reward challenges for a little bit. As a segment, the reward challenge has become less and less of a focus on Survivor over the years, and I think that's a shame. For me, the reward challenge is essential to both the game's format and the show as a television product. I've always liked the way a 39-day game of Survivor breaks down into 16 3-day rounds that each contain 3 standard events: a reward challenge, an immunity challenge, and a tribal council, all of which advance the season's game state. Reward challenges can have a variety of effects on the game, including tribe strength in the early game and personal relationships in the post-merge. It's the post-merge rewards that really shine in the old school era. Individual rewards often gave the show an opportunity to show off the season's location and culture, as well as develop players as characters. Africa is the perfect season to use as an example of that. Usually, a season of Survivor would have 1 or maybe 2 of what I like to call the once-in-a-lifetime reward. I touched on this type of reward in part 2 when Colby committed an Australian felony, but broadly speaking, these were rewards where 1 or 2 castaways got to journey away from camp on an adventure that immersed them in the local culture. And Africa had like 4 of these rewards. I guess that's kind of what happens when your season is shot on the Shaba Reserve. There was the time Lex and Big Tom got to go on a safari in a hot air balloon and stay at a luxury camp where Big Tom got hammered. For those of you keeping track at home, this was the first, but not the last, time that Big Tom would get drunk on the show. Oh, and then there was the one where Brandon and Frank, of all people, got to camp out and watch Out of Africa Under the Stars, an experience both guys managed to enjoy despite hating each other. And how about all of Lex and Ethan's adventures to Kenyan villages? Towards the end of the season, Lex won a reward that involved delivering AIDS relief supplies to a small Kenyan hospital, an image that sticks out in most people's memories of this season. Lex made that delivery using the other part of this reward, a brand new Chevy Avalanche.
Introducing the all-new Chevy Avalanche.
This was something we also saw in the Australian Outback, but of course, Colby got a Pontiac Aztek, which is roughly 1,000 times cooler than Lex's Avalanche. Now that we had seen the car reward twice, a new Survivor tradition was officially established. The Final 5 reward challenge was now known as the Car Challenge, which, along with the Survivor Auction, which also made its second appearance in Africa, became a fan favorite that viewers looked forward to seeing come back with each new season. The delivery mission in the Chevy Avalanche was actually Lex and Ethan's second trip to the village of Wamba, which brings us back to the Episode 9 reward challenge. Ethan won the challenge and chose Lex to join him for the reward, citing that Lex was the closest to beating him as his only reasoning for the choice, a typical example of Ethan's social savviness. The reward itself involved a bumpy 3-hour ride to Wamba Village where Ethan and Lex would barter 2 goats for food and money with local merchants. I feel like this goat trading scene represents the heart and soul of what old school Survivor was. Sure, we loved watching the social strategy and seeing who was the best at playing this game, but more than that, old school Survivor was about spending time with these TV characters as they experienced a completely foreign world. Modern Survivor sorely lacks scenes like this one. For all of the benefits the show gets from staying in Fiji, it's lost the sense of worldliness and global community that colored the older seasons with a layer of humanity. The show was at its best when it was able to balance scenes like this with the social intrigue and strategic thinking, and while this season may lean heavier on the character moments, I still prefer this outcome compared to what happens when the show narrows in on just the strategic game. While the iconic image from the first trip to Wamba is usually thought to be Ethan playing hacky sack with the kids of the village, I'd like to point your attention to what I think is a much more important clip.
Shirts. They gave me a bracelet, I gave him my shirt right off my back, I gave him my hat off my head.
Did you catch that? It was quick, but something hugely important just happened. Ethan sold his shirt, completing his transformation into Blue Shirt Ethan.
Here comes a new challenger!
When Ethan sold his long-sleeve shirt in Wamba, it was like a butterfly shedding its cocoon. He had kinda loafed around for the first half of the game, but now it was time to fly. After he switched to his blue shirt variant, Ethan's edit took off to the point where he was positioned as the season's frontrunner for the rest of the game. By the final 6 or so, most people were rooting for Ethan to win, and his uptick in challenge wins and complex confessionals was evidence that the fan favorite would finally win a season. However, some of Survivor's early superfans had suspected Ethan to be the winner from the very start of the season. On December 5th, 2001, the day before the first Blue Shirt Ethan episode aired, a post entitled "Follow the Star, the Real Episode Episode 1 spoiler was posted to the website Survivor Sucks by a user named TapeWatcherB65. Survivor Sucks is a fan forum that has been active for basically the show's entire history and is still relatively popular to this day. I avoided this site for most of my life due to its reputation for highly accurate Survivor spoilers. That reputation can be traced back to the site's earliest days, when posts like Follow the Star were the main traffic draw for the site. Despite its title, Follow the Star wasn't necessarily a real spoiler. It was more of an elaborate theory that made a winner prediction based on the show's editing. Follow the Star was not the first of its kind, because as it turns out, Tape Watcher is also responsible for a post known as The Dog That Didn't Bite, which predicted Tina as Australia's winner based on its editing. That theory has had so much influence on the show's fan community that fans call Tina's strategy the dog that didn't bite, even if they have never heard of Tape Watcher or even Survivor Sucks. Tape Watcher has to be considered the grandfather of what is called
Edgic.
Edgic is a fan-made word that refers to the simultaneous use of logic and editing analysis while watching Survivor to determine who is the most likely winner of the game. Much of the general discourse about Survivor today centers around Edgic, but back in the old school era, online superfans like Tape Watcher were the only people really looking at the show this way. These original long-form breakdowns from Tape Watcher are like the holy texts of old school Survivor, and looking back at them today proves that discussion of the finer details of Survivor has been going on since the very beginning. Follow the Star is a pretty elaborate piece of internet writing that predicted Ethan as Africa's winner using mainly the edit of the premiere episode as evidence. The theory claims that the season was edited to portray Ethan as a Christ figure and to show the sun as a symbol for the Star of David when it appears over Ethan and the Baran tribe. Tape Watcher laid out this theory with an in-depth analysis of every scene of the premiere episode in an article that reads like a peer-reviewed academic paper. I'm not sure how much of this theory I can really buy into, it's just so specific and extremely pretentious by Survivor standards, but Tape Watcher did include one argument for their theory that I do find very compelling. In the post, Tape Watcher proposed this hypothetical, quote, "You're the executive producer of a reality show. You cared enough about your winner in Season 2 that you spent the entire show editing out every strategic act she did so she'd be presentable as a likable winner. You've just finished Season 3 and you know who won it already. For the sake of argument, let's say it's a young man who by all accounts is soft-spoken, moral, and likable, with a big beard and funny hair, and he's Jewish. You're an egomaniac with a god complex that feels he can twist reality into anything he wants in order to present entertaining television. You don't just produce routine television. You're a man of grand ideas with important messages to present. You can put whatever cuts you wish onto the tape and then put others around them to hide what your real intention is," unquote. I have to admit, if anyone would do this with their reality game show, it would be Mark Burnett. We are talking about a man who unironically believed he was producing modern Shakespeare every Thursday night. This reasoning was certainly good enough for lots of online fans to start following the Star each episode, and week after week, the theory held firm. Ethan, in all his new blue shirt glory, became the main frontrunner to win the game, as the Baran boys dictated the votes. He actually played more of a second-in-command role within the Alliance, and allowed Lex to take the reputation of the shot caller that determined the jury members' fates. By all accounts, Ethan put himself in this position intentionally, setting the precedent for the successful use of a bigger threat as a shield. In this case, it was more of a social shield than a strategic one, but the concept remains the same. As the power player within the Baran boys, Lex took the brunt of the backlash for all of their successful votes, which included Brandon in round 9, Frank in round 10, Kim Powers at the final 6, and lastly T-Bird at the final 5. A mini pagonging that I will admit can be a little slow going. All the more reason to appreciate the reward segments in the Postmerge episodes, in my opinion. On the surface, Lex was dominating the game, but all things considered, with or without following the Star, this was Ethan's game to lose by the time of the Final Four. Ethan was liked by just about everyone on the jury, Tom and Lex had had a falling out and were now targeting each other, and it was Ethan that was closest with Kim Johnson out of the Baran boys, which gave him an upper hand if she won immunity. The Final Four Immunity Challenge saw the return of an old favorite, Fallen Comrades, a question and answer challenge that took place in front of the jury. This challenge rewarded players who focused on social play and could also affect the jury's opinion of players, two things that are rare to find in a challenge, even in the old school era. The Africa iteration of Fallen Comrades came down to the last question in a contest between Lex and Kim. The final question was which female castaway had no piercings. Kim's answer of Kelly was deemed to be correct, and she won the challenge. With the Braun boys unable to target Kim, they were finally forced to turn on each other. Lex and Tom voted for each other, which gave Kim and Ethan the choice of which one they wanted to take out. They chose to keep Lex and sent Big Tom home in 4th place. However, when this finale episode aired, it was revealed that Lindsay, Lex's answer for the question, also had no piercings. Upon hearing this on finale night, Lex was allegedly furious with production, although this has been disputed. The prevailing theory is that Lex and Tom were both awarded the 2nd place prize money of $100,000 as compensation for this mistake. It is also heavily speculated that both guys were promised a spot on the cast of an all-star season of Survivor, if that were ever going to become a reality one day. The main reason Ethan and Kim opted to keep Lex over Big Tom was twofold. First, Ethan and Lex had grown pretty close throughout the game, and second, Lex's prophecy had finally come true.
Anybody knows that you don't just belly up to the stream that you're camping next to, drop your canteen in it and drink the water. If you don't boil your water out here, you end up with what they call amoebic dysentery, which basically has you puking and crapping your guts.
Dehydration had finally broken Lex's resolve. He took the risk of drinking water full of
elephant dung.
I'm gonna need you to go ahead and put it in the deep freeze, Jillian. This is important. Anyway, despite clearly knowing the consequences, Lex drank the dirty water, and he paid the price for it. Lex ingested multiple parasites, and by the time of the final 3, he was suffering with amoebic dysentery, the exact same illness he had warned about in the first episode. In a poetic twist of irony, Lex's illness began shortly after Teresa revealed to him that it was actually her who had cast the mystery vote back when Clarence went home. This meant that Lex took out Kelly for no reason, based on his own gut feeling. First, his gut was wrong in the figurative sense, and now that he had dysentery, it was wrong in the literal sense. You just know Mark Burnett was loving this. Despite racking up a number of Postmerge challenge wins, even against the might of blue shirt Ethan, Lex stood almost no chance of winning the final immunity challenge. In classic fashion, that challenge came on day 38 in the form of hands on a hard idol, the same endurance test that first appeared at Borneo's final 3. There's a reason just about every old school season uses this challenge or something very similar to it for the final immunity. It asked one of Survivor's fundamental questions: who wants it more? Hands on a Hard Idol also gives us one last look at the season's location, with the Africa version showcasing the arid Kenyan grassland while the challenge played out. After nearly 2.5 hours, Ethan, America's new beloved hero, lost his focus and fell out of the challenge. The blue shirt's powers had dried up at the worst possible time. This left us with one final showdown between a literal grandma and a man who was borderline unconscious due to a parasitic disease. Lex may have blown up his game multiple times, but he could still win against Kim Johnson in a final 2. He just had to keep his hand on the idol. In the end, Lex's delirium caused him to stumble and lose his footing, and maybe $1 million along with it. Kim Johnson had pulled off the unlikeliest of back-to-back individual immunity wins to punch her ticket to the final 2, and it was no secret who she was taking with her. Kim cast the sole vote for Lex and ended his game one step short of the finish line. Lex's elimination took most of the remaining tension out of the Africa finale. The rest of this episode seemed like a formality on the way to the crowning of Ethan Zohn. The final vote was a surprisingly close 4-3 decision in favor of Ethan, and while most people had seen it coming, it was still a very important outcome to the show's future. Ethan was the first out-and-out fan favorite to win the game, and his win proved that fans weren't always going to get snake-bitten by the show when someone like Richard won out over their favorites. In other words, you could be a good, likable person and still win Survivor, an idea that was often considered highly unlikely after the first season. Survivor Africa has never had a strong legacy. Instead, this season has carried a reputation for being slow and boring for as long as I can remember. It was the obvious black sheep out of the first 3 seasons, and remains a tough sell for newer fans that haven't seen it yet. At the same time, it played a huge part in the show's history and set up the next series of major developments for the game, from both a player perspective and the producer perspective. It's a bridge season that connects the Survivor Mania seasons to the old school seasons that I think have aged the best, the first of which we'll get to next time. If you're still here, I want to sincerely thank you. Making this video has been really tough, but I know there are some people who truly love this series, and that alone motivates me to make these as good as I can. I basically had to make this one twice because my hard drive got corrupted during the first attempt, And because of that, that kind of caused me to rework some of the things that were going to be in this video. And before you know it, it's been almost a year to the date since the last Survivor video got published. And all I can do is ask you to stick by me and trust that new videos are coming as fast as I can do them. I'm always working on stuff, and I'm always trying to speed up my process because I just, I like doing this and I want to get more stuff out there. So like I said, I can't thank you enough for your support. It really does mean a lot. And let me know what you thought of this video in the comments, and I guess keep your eyes peeled, and I'll see you soon.